I'm Matt Corser from the Strengthening and Sustaining Ohio Suicide Prevention Coalition's initiative. Welcome to Segment 9 on scoring your CRA interviews. This training segment is designed to support the CRA scoring teams in each community, as well as project managers. We will introduce the scoring process for the community readiness model. We'll review the materials you need for scoring. We'll describe how to use the anchored rating scales, and describe how to complete the individual and consensus scoring sheets. As always, all of these resources are on the webpage, including this video, supporting materials including the PowerPoint slide deck, the manual, anchored rating scales, and scoring sheets. As a recap, let's talk for a minute about readiness scores in the community readiness model. There are 5 dimensions of readiness in the model, including community knowledge of efforts, leadership, community climate, knowledge about the issues, resources. And there are 9 levels of readiness that run from no awareness all the way through community ownership. The CRM scoring process provides an overall community readiness score as well as readiness scores for each of the 5 dimensions included in the model. As a reminder, you're going to need 2 scores, and these scores should not have been part of your interviewing team. Your scorers will work independently to score the interviews. We call that individual scoring. Then they're going to work together to create consensus scores through the CRM consensus scoring process. You'll use both individual and consensus scoring sheets and anchored rating scales that are part of the model. To prepare for the scoring process, you're going to want to make sure that each of your scores has 5 different colors of highlighters. It's helpful to designate one color for each of the 5 dimensions. You're going to want to make sure that you print the CRM anchored rating scales. And note that there is one rating scale for each of the 5 dimensions of readiness. We have both individual and consensus scoring sheets. We've created those as a Microsoft Excel file. For your scoring team, you'll either want to make sure that they can open those scoring files, or you can go ahead and print them out. But each scorer will need both an individual scoring sheet and a consensus scoring sheet. We also recommend that your scoring team reviews the handbook section on scoring, which runs from page 26 to page 29. And it's also helpful to have this PowerPoint slide deck available. Here is an image of the CRM anchored rating scale for community knowledge of efforts. You're going to note that there are whole numbers, and those points on the anchored rating scale are well defined. You can't see all of the scale points in this image, but they should give you an idea of what the anchored rating scale looks like. In addition to the main numbers, you're going to see dash marks, and those correspond to decimals, 0.25, 0.50, 0.75. Using decimal points actually does help provide a more nuanced readiness score rating. Here is what the individual scoring sheet looks like. It's got a place for the name of the scorer, the date the scoring took place, and columns for each of the CRA interviews. Note that the individual scoring sheet was set up with 7 columns corresponding to 7 interviews. If you have more than 7 interviews, it's no problem at all in the Microsoft Excel file to just add columns to the right. You'll also see that there are rows for each of the 5 dimensions. Let's talk now about the CRA individual scoring process. First, each of your scorers is going to score each CRA interview individually. They're going to actually score it by dimension. So starting with dimension A, which is community knowledge of efforts, each scorer will read the anchored rating scale for that dimension, then read the entire interview's transcript and highlight statements that relate to aspects of dimension A, which is, in this case, community knowledge of efforts. Then your scorer is going to review the highlighted statements and compare those statements to the anchored points on the anchored rating scale. what they will do is they will look to find the point on the anchored rating scale that best reflects what those highlighted statements say about readiness on that dimension. The first anchored rating point is no knowledge of the issue. So if you review a transcript and it shows that there's some knowledge of the issue or a lot of knowledge about the issue, what you'll do is you'll go up that anchored rating scale until the community, as evidenced by the highlighted statements, does not exceed the statement. Essentially, what you want to do is not only define that best fit on the anchored rating scale for your community as reflected in those highlighted statements, but to continue on until you can't move to the next statement on the rating scale. It's important to know that to receive a score at a certain stage of readiness, that entire statement has to be true for the community, for that interview. Phrased differently, for you to assign a score at a certain stage, all of the highlighted statements in an interview have to be true. If any of them is false, you have to fall back to the previous readiness score. Once you've done this for dimension A, you're going to turn to the individual scoring sheet and fill in that score for interview number 1. And as a reminder, you don't have to use whole numbers. Here's an example of an individual scoring sheet after scoring dimension A for interview number 1. After you complete dimension A, you'll then continue to dimension B, which is leadership, and repeat the same process. The scorers will pick a different highlighter color. They'll highlight all the statements related to leadership. They'll review all those highlights and compare those statements to the anchored rating scale for dimension B. And what they'll do is they'll identify the readiness score that best reflects dimension B for that interview. And as a reminder, all of those, to receive a rating, all of the highlighted statements have to be true for the rating. Your scorer will then record the readiness score for dimension B on the individual scoring sheet. This process will then be repeated again for dimensions C, D, and E until all dimensions have been scored for that interview. You'll then score the rest of the interviews in the exact same way, starting with dimension A, proceeding through dimension B, C, D, and E. And you'll fill out the individual scoring sheet as the scorer moves along. As a note, that scoring sheet can be printed out, but it also can be used as an Excel file. And it's always fine to add columns to the right if there are more interviews than there are columns on the sheet. As an example, here's an individual scoring sheet with all 5 dimensions scored for the first CRA interview. As another example, here's what a completed individual scoring sheet would look like. You'll note that in this case, for all 7 of the interviews, there are readiness scores identified by each scorer for each of the 5 dimensions. And you'll notice as well that they vary pretty widely, and that's absolutely fine, and that's to be expected. After each scorer has scored each of the interviews individually, your scoring team is then going to meet, and they have to discuss how they scored each dimension of each interview. It's important to know that the COVID-19 pandemic means that social distancing and/or Zoom technology is going to be really important for the consensus scoring process. It's important to make sure that your scorers are safe during the consensus process. The consensus scoring process is going to focus on the interviews one by one. And when one scorer's rating on a dimension differs from the other scorer's rating, the scorers are going to need to reach a consensus score. Consensus in this case means agreement. A consensus score is not an average. Consensus simply means that the scorers come to agreement on the score that best reflects the readiness reflected for that dimension in each interview. You'll want your scorers to discuss why they rated a dimension a certain way on each interview. And it's important that they do come to an agreement on what the best readiness score is for each dimension of each interview. Those consensus scores are then going to be entered into the consensus scoring table for each dimension of each interview. This is what a blank consensus scoring table looks like. And you're going to note that it looks almost identical to the individual scoring sheet, except that on the far right, there's a column for average, and then there's a row for an overall community readiness score. Your scores will leave the average column and the overall community readiness scores blank. They don't need to worry about them at this point. Here's an example of a completed consensus scoring table. This is what it would look like after both scores have met and have identified consensus scores. And this completed consensus scoring table is what you will give to the project manager so that she or he can compute the overall readiness scores and the dimension-specific readiness scores for your community. Here are some tips and tricks. First, the interviewer should not be one of the scorers. We want to make sure that we emphasize that. Second, anyone on your coalition can help with the scoring. Once the combined scoring is complete, the project manager can do the final calculations. And this is better than having the scorers do the calculations themselves. It's also important to note that your scorers do not need to have read or have a copy of the entire triethnic model manual. We recommend actually creating a packet for each scorer, which is going to include the following: an individual scoring table, and that actually can be printed or provided to them as an Excel file, depending on what they're comfortable with. A consensus scoring table, again, printed or as an Excel file, depending on their comfort level. You'll need to give them a paper copy of each transcript and a copy of the anchored rating scales attached to each transcript. These packets will let your scorers highlight and mark up the transcript, and it allows them to make notes on the rating scale sheets. And that's going to help them as they discuss their combined scores with your other scorer. Let's talk now about some frequently asked questions. First, we had one interview that was very different from the others. Should we throw it out? We recommend that your team first try to understand the reason for the difference. It may be that there's a good reason for this, that it has to do with where that key informant is in your community. And if there is a good reason for that, then that big difference in the interviews is not a problem. But if you do find that one of the key informants is not a good representative, you can consider replacing the interview with another interview you conduct with someone else in your community. Second, a frequently asked question is, how do I use the numbers on a scale of 1 to 10 that the respondents are asked to give? It's important to note that these 1 to 10 ratings are not figured into the scoring dimension in any way. Allowing your key informants to choose a number gives a reference point, corresponding to a little or a lot, to respondents, and generally makes it easier for them to expand with more detail when they answer the questions. But again, you're not going to use those 1 to 10 ratings in your scoring process. When scoring, the two scorers could not come to an agreement on a single score. What should be done? If your two scorers are having trouble getting to agreement, we recommend that they agree on a compromise score. For example, if one believes the score should be 3 and the other believes 3.5, as a last resort, you can split the difference and score as a 3.25. Another frequently asked question: should we use decimal points in scoring? And the answer there is yes. Those decimal points are going to lead to greater accuracy in arriving at the composite scores at the end of the scoring process. We recommend that you use 0.25, 0.5, and 0.75 to accurately reflect responses between the stages based on the anchored rating scales. And these also correspond to the dashed lines on the anchored rating scales. This training segment is focused on providing a step-by-step overview of the scoring process, both the individual scoring process and the consensus scoring process. We've worked to identify materials that are going to be needed to support your scores and to support an effective scoring process. Segment 10 will be of use for project managers, and it's going to focus on computing the overall and dimension-specific readiness scores. As always, these resources are on the web page, including the video, supporting materials such as this PowerPoint slide deck, the manual, the anchored rating scales, and the individual and consensus scoring sheets. Again, these are provided as Excel files, but they can be printed out if that's better. Thank you for being part of this training session.